Well, our speaker this morning is Kyle Wright. When he heard it announced that his older brother Kevin was going to introduce him, he turned to me and said, "No, please, no." So I'm going to get the pleasure of introducing him. Kevin Wright, Kyle Wright, and Jonathan Roberts came here yesterday visiting with us, spent the day here at the school, and we really enjoyed getting to be with them and listen to them share with us some of their experiences and wisdom from ministry. I've known these guys for quite a long time. Kyle went through the school some 20 years ago. At the age of 21, entered into ministry, full-time ministry. He's been in full-time ministry ever since. I've noticed in Kyle a great deal of maturity and wisdom and humility. He's a great listener, always has been for me, and I've just appreciated that so very much. Kyle is also a much better speaker than his older brother. And so I'm not going to spend near as much time introducing him as I did Kevin. But Kyle, I love you, brother. I'm excited to hear what you have to say to us. Come on up here, please.
Good morning. I appreciate the kind words, even though they're not true, Paul. As Paul mentioned, I started in ministry at a young age, and that has accelerated things and for me as you make the jump from ministry to ministry. I started off in youth ministry because there are not a lot of churches clamoring to hire a 21-year-old preacher. I started preaching when I was 28 years old, though, and honestly thought that it wasn't going to be much of a challenge for me. I'd done youth ministry for several years, and I had preached on occasion, and then I figured out they wanted me to preach every Sunday, and that changed things. I will never forget just getting started. I was preaching through the book of 1 Corinthians, and I'd hit chapter 14, and I wanted to do something clever. I was confident enough in myself to try to get clever, which was a mistake, but I'm talking about speaking in tongues and whether or not that's a good idea in relation to unbelievers. And so I thought maybe I could introduce part of my sermon by speaking a different language. I don't speak any different languages, so that was going to be a challenge. But I walked in. I've traveled through Central and South America enough to pick up a little bit of Spanish, and so I walked in to worship and stood up to preach and said, "Buenos dias," which means, and I said, "Bienvenidos," which means, I said, "Calas muy guapo," which means, what are you laughing at? Sitting right over here was a little girl, ninth grader, Spanish 1. When I said "Calas muy guapo," Jordan Young went like this. And then she busts up laughing. And I thought, I know I shouldn't. But I went ahead and asked her, "Jordan, what's so funny?" And she said, "My fault, I just mistranslated. You said Calas muy guapo, Carlos very handsome, but I translated Carlos muy gordo, which means Carlos very fat." And so Jordan wasn't thinking, "Yeah, Carlos a pretty good looking guy." Jordan was thinking, "Yeah, Carlos pretty chubby." She was right there too. It is a bit of a surreal experience standing here before you this morning. I first walked into the flag room in 1994 as an aimer. I was 18 years old. I was going to change the world. I was arrogant and undisciplined and immature. I want to share with you a little bit this morning what I wish, and somebody probably did, but I want to share with you what I wish someone would have set me down and told me as I was striking out in ministry. I wanted to do mission work from the time I was pretty young, 14, 15 years old. I wanted to do international missions, and AIM was the only option, the only choice for me. And so I set about raising support and came to the AIM program in 1994. Had no business being here. I was eager and I was excited, but I was also, as I mentioned, undisciplined and immature. Got put on a team to Mexico City, went to Mexico City in Mexico City chewed me up and spit me out. Got as sick as I'd ever been in my life, came back from Mexico City, said, I can't do that. Wound up moving up to Edmond, Oklahoma. My brother had started a campus ministry, and I was working for a church, and he was about to graduate. And Edmond, Oklahoma is home to Oklahoma Christian University. At the time, 3 churches of Christ with well over 1,000 members each. Not exactly a mission field. I worked hard for the kingdom, but I don't know that I ever felt like I was doing mission work. I figured out real quickly that I was ill-equipped for ministry, and so I came back to Lubbock in January of 1995 to attend the School of Preaching. And at that time, the big push was we're going to plant churches in all the mega cities of the world. Richard Rogers was leading that charge, and man, he had me excited. By the time my 2 years here was over, it was clear that I wasn't ready for anything like that. And so I moved to Altus, Oklahoma, a place that makes Lubbock, Texas look like a tropical paradise and the cultural center of the universe. Not exactly a mission field. I worked hard for the kingdom, but I don't know that I ever felt like I was doing mission work. I wanted something different. I spent a few years in Altus and wanted something different, and so my wife and I made the decision to move to Knoxville, Tennessee, where I worked with a much larger, much more affluent church as a youth minister. I wanted to expand the scope of my influence. I wanted an opportunity at least to reach the unchurched, and so moved to Knoxville, Tennessee, where there were several churches of Christ. Knoxville is kind of the buckle of the Bible Belt. Not exactly a mission field. I worked hard for the kingdom, but I don't know that I ever felt like I was doing mission work. Finished my time in Knoxville, resigned from that church not knowing where God was going to lead us, and wound up in Cushing, Oklahoma. I just knew I wanted an opportunity to work with real-world kind of problems. Wound up in Cushing, Oklahoma. Anybody ever been to Cushing, Oklahoma? Great. Been there preaching for the last, going on 13 years now. Not exactly a mission field. Or so I believed. Let me tell you a quick story about my transition from Knoxville, Tennessee to Cushing, Oklahoma. In Knoxville, I was a youth minister, and I worked with spoiled little rich kids. Very few of those kids understood how the world really worked. And those that did have real-world kind of problems, I found myself gravitating towards. One of those girls, maybe the most spoiled little girl I've ever met in my life, her name's Becca. Becca's family had lots of money, but Becca was just as spoiled as she could be. But Becca also had some real-world problems. Her father's bipolar and didn't often take his medication, and could become violent at times. And so I got a phone call from Becca. We had already resigned from that church. We were just kind of finishing up a few things before we moved. Got a call from Becca one night just sobbing inconsolably. I said, Becca, what's going on? I wouldn't even known it was her had it not been for caller ID. Becca, what's going on? What's going on? What's going on? And she finally choked out, he promised, Kyle, he promised. And I said, what, Becca? What is going on? And she said, my dad, and that scared me. Becca, what is going on? She couldn't articulate anything. And finally I said, Becca, listen to me. If you don't tell me what's going on right now, I'm going to hang up this phone and I'm going to call 911. I was afraid he'd hit her. And she said, Kyle, he promised. I said, Becca, what did he promise? She said, he promised I could drive the Jaguar to school tomorrow, but I have to drive the Mercedes instead. I laughed in her ear and hung up that phone. 2 months later, I find myself in Cushing, Oklahoma, where I have just received a phone call that 2 of our members were cooking methamphetamines in a trailer house just north of town. The police found out, kicked in their door, hauled them off the jail. And my thought was, I need to try to get hold of them. I need to see them before they're transferred to the county seat in Stillwater. And so I'm driving towards our little jail there in town, and and the thought hits me, I know that April, who was related to Brian and Denise, who'd been involved in the drug bust, will know where they're at and what's going on. She works at the hospital. So I have a little Jeep Wrangler, and I turned that Jeep down Highland Street in Cushing, Oklahoma, off Highway 33, and headed for the hospital. And out of the corner of my eye, I see Melanie and Michelle, a lesbian couple who'd been worshiping with us, riding their bicycles down an alleyway. And so my thought was, well, Melanie and Michelle will know what's going on. And so I whipped my Jeep down this alleyway to follow them when the thought strikes me like a thunderbolt. I'm chasing two lesbians down an alleyway to get the 411 on our drug-abusing members. God, what is up here? What are we doing, you know? It's that ministry that I want to talk to you a little bit about today. Turn to John chapter 4. If you've got a Bible, if you don't have a Bible, shame on you. Get to where you can see one. I'm not going to read the entirety of the text. We're going to focus our attention on verses 27 through 35. And I would love to. I'd love to take the time just to remind you of some things you already know. Jesus had to go through Samaria. Most Jews would have crossed the Jordan River and walked miles out of their way not to have to do that, but Jesus had to. He met a woman at a well that was drawing water in the heat of the day. Initiates a conversation with this woman. She's wondering why they're talking in the first place. His disciples leave the well and make their way into town to buy food. And as they're gone, he winds up sharing his deity with this woman. I'm going to pick up, I want to just kind of get a little bit of a flow here. Look at verse 13, if you would, please. They're talking about the well. Jesus answered, "Everyone who drinks this water will be thirsty again, but whoever drinks the water I give him will never thirst. Indeed, the water I give him will become in him a spring of water welling up to eternal life." The woman said to him, "Sir, give me this water so that I won't get thirsty and have to keep coming here to draw water." What's she thinking in this moment? The water's great, but is that really what this is about? I think she dreaded this journey day in and day out because she was afraid, because of the way that she had lived, she would encounter somebody who would remind her of her past and her present. And so she thought, if I have the kind of water that doesn't necessitate a daily trip to the well, I can save myself that. Give me the water. He told her, "Go call your husband and come back." "I have no husband," she replied. "I know," Jesus said. "Fact is, you've had 5. You're sleeping with a guy now who you're not married to. What you've said is quite true. You don't have a husband." You know what she does next? This is beautiful to me because it's me. This is what I do. She changes the subject. "Go call your husband." "Don't have a husband." "I know you've had 5. Now you're sleeping with a guy you're not married to." You know, I've been wondering about something I want to ask you about, Jesus. Where's the right place to worship, Jerusalem or Mount Gerizim? You know what I love about Jesus in this moment? She changes the subject and he lets her do it. That's compassion. Instead of nailing her to the wall, he allows her to change the subject and goes with the flow. And he's still working an angle here, and we know where this is headed. They wind up talking about the proper way to worship, and Jesus ultimately says, really it doesn't matter. And she just kind of throws her hands up and says, "I know it doesn't matter. I know when the Messiah comes, he's going to explain everything to us." And what does Jesus say? "I who speak to you am he." In that moment, in the moment where her eternity is hanging in the balance, the disciples make their way back from town. We're going to pick up in verse 27. Just then his disciples returned and were surprised to find him talking with a woman. But no one asked, "What do you want?" or "Why are you talking with her?" You know what strikes me about verse 27 is that Jesus' disciples don't seem to have a clue what's going on. They'd seen Jesus minister to the masses before, right? I know this is relatively early in his ministry, but in the end of John chapter 2, they're in Jerusalem for the Passover, and Jesus is doing what Jesus does. He's making a difference in the lives of mankind. They'd seen Jesus at work. But when they stumble onto this conversation between Jesus and the Samaritan woman, they don't recognize what he's doing. Why is that? It's the same reason I moved from Edmond, Oklahoma, to Altus, Oklahoma, to Knoxville, Tennessee, to Cushing, Oklahoma, looking for a mission field and not finding one or feeling like I'd found one. Jesus' disciples didn't recognize what Jesus was doing here in this moment because they didn't recognize that this woman was worth saving. Jesus' disciples had no interest in Samaritan mission work. And for the first half of my ministry career, I didn't either. Look at verse 28. Then leaving her water jar, the woman went back to the town and said to the people, "Come see a man who told me everything I ever did. Could this man be the Christ?" They came out of the town and made their way toward him. Meanwhile, his disciples urged him, "Rabbi, teacher, eat something." But he said to them, "I have food to eat that you know nothing about." Then his disciples said to each other, "Could someone have brought him food?" "My food," said Jesus, "is to do the will of him who sent me and to finish his work. Do you not say 4 months more and then the harvest? I tell you, open your eyes and look at the fields. They are ripe for harvest." Now, I believe that that's a verse you've heard before, right? That's a staple of Sunset's curriculum and mission, that the fields are ripe for harvest. What this text doesn't spell out, but what I am convinced of in my mind and in my spirit, and I've had conversation with God, you'll just have to take my word for it, okay? What I'm convinced of is that when Jesus says, "Open your eyes and look," he's probably pointing as he's doing it. He's pointing to a group of people cresting a hill that are coming to find out whether or not this woman that has reported her story is actually right, that the Messiah has actually come. He's saying, I tell you, open your eyes and look. An entire town here in Samaria is coming to find whether or not the Messiah is here. What I've learned, what I'm still learning, is that there is a mission field in every community if our eyes are open to see it. I spend my days with drug addicts and with alcoholics, with the mentally ill, with people involved in the kind of sexual immorality that would make Jerry Springer blush. I spend my days with those who've been marginalized by both society and the church, because Jesus has opened my eyes to see that the fields are ripe for harvest. I'm not telling you not to do mission work. Please, by all means, plant a church in one of the great mega cities of the world. What I'm telling you this morning, and what I wish somebody would have told me, and what I wish I would have had the humility to hear and accept 20 plus years ago, is that ministry is available wherever there are people. There's a mission field in every community if your eyes have been open to see that the fields are ripe for harvest. Don't worry about where God sends you. Worry about doing right by the people God sends you to. Pray with me. God, you know how often I have thought about, dreamed of, having an opportunity like this one to speak to people who have committed themselves to furthering your kingdom. It's funny, got to look at my watch, and looks like I'm done ahead of time. And I never thought that would be the case. And so I just ask and I pray this morning that this room is full of people who aren't planning for ministry, who aren't strategizing to plant churches and to build up your kingdom in faraway places. I pray that this room is full of people who recognize that every day we're given on earth is another opportunity to share the good news that we have found in Jesus Christ with someone who desperately needs to hear it. There are people in Lubbock, Texas, just as lost as the people in deepest, darkest Africa. And I pray that as you've given us this opportunity to prepare, to dream, that we not miss the fact that there may be Samaritans surrounding us. People who, like this woman we've read about, are full of shame and guilt and sin and really don't know where to turn. I pray, God, that you open our eyes to see that the fields are ripe for harvest. I pray as Lord of the harvest that you send workers out into that harvest field. I pray that souls are saved and that you are glorified. And I pray it all in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.